mean later on, but like global means like you see your whole life is negative. Stable means your life has always been negative and always will be negative. And internal causal attribution means that you probably did something to make it negative. And then over time, you kind of flipped all of those over to talk about how you can have a more optimistic explanatory style. And then he got into positive psychology. And so kind of, now he talks about, he got from learned helplessness to pessimistic explanatory style, and then learned optimism. So he learned helplessness, learned optimism, and now positive psychology. It's an interesting trajectory. It's kind of fun. Somewhat related but distinct, Margaret Baltus, Paul Baltus's wife, did a lot of work looking at nursing homes and applying basically kind of applied behavior analysis, behavior therapy approaches, and behavior analytic approaches to looking at what's going on in nursing homes, and saw the dependent behavior that everybody sees in nursing home environments, but attribute it to the environment rather than to the patients. So rather than just seeing it as like a natural part of aging or as a consequence of the physical problems or brain problems that people had, she saw it as being behavior that was probably inadvertently taught by the staff. I don't think she mostly thinks that staff sort of do this on purpose, but that the staff sort of probably mostly unintentionally reinforce dependent behavior and punish independent behavior. Sometimes you also see this kind of overtly in policies about keeping the facility from getting sued, which means keeping people in wheelchairs when they probably could walk, although not very steadily. And there's a whole interesting line of research, set of studies about that. And then probably the one kind of clearly geropsych theory that's developed over time is socio-emotional selectivity theory by Laura Carstensen at Stanford. What Carstensen originally, back in the early 90s, the dilemma that she was looking at and trying to explain as she developed this theory was that social networks get smaller as we get older. And actually it starts when you're about 30, but it's another story. It starts earlier than most people think of when you say that statement. But our social networks kind of narrow down as you get older. But life satisfaction, to everybody's surprise, including gerontologists and geropsychologists, life satisfaction stays pretty stable across the adult lifespan. If anything, if there's any differences at all, older adults actually tend to be more satisfied than young adults rather than less. And so this was kind of a dilemma because, social support is supposed to support your life satisfaction. So why is it that you have smaller social networks and equal life satisfaction? And the early versions of socio-emotional selectivity theory said, well, you have smaller networks, but the total amount of social emotional investment in that network is the same because the people that are still in your network are the people that you really care about. And when you're young, you have like lots of acquaintances and friends, but they're not as close to you as the people that you still have in your network when you're old. And so you sort of have the same amount of support with fewer people. Yeah. Okay. Then the last decade or so, she's introduced this into thinking about emotion theory and how emotion and cognition relate, and we'll talk about the ups and downs of that when we get there in the course. It's also sometimes represented, like in theories classes, you can see this as a sort of kind of an integration of activity theory and disengagement theory. Yeah. Other contenders, we see some of these as theories or not, but there's increasingly kind of a focus on behavior genetics, and actually some people have kind of, in psychology as a whole, and people have started looking at thinking about behavior genetics and and how that changes with age. It turns out the early thought was that the older you got, the less genetic influence there would be, because if there was a genetic influence on something, it would show up when you were young, and also that the more life experience you have, the more individualized you would get. It turns out that at least for certain things, actually there appear to be genetic effects that don't turn up until you're old, and some things where there's actually more genetic loading in people over 60 than there is in people in their 20s. But it varies by particular, both physical disease and psychological disorder. Stress and coping models, but I've spent a lot of my time, I came close to saying too much of my time, but it depends on what mood I've been looking at over the last several years. And we'll talk about those late in the course. These are ways of looking at how our appraisal of stress and social support and coping styles influence both health and mental health outcomes. Health psychology models, which just generally look at the relationship between psychological variables and physical health outcomes, and also look at the ways that psychological variables affect whether people adhere to their treatments or not. You know, like nobody does. Not just old people, but I mean at all ages. People don't take their medication. People don't follow their doctor's orders. So why not? What can you do to change that? That's one part of what happens here. Margaret Baltus from the earlier slide and her husband Paul collaborated for the last couple of decades of their lives on the selective optimization with compensation idea, model, prescription. It tends to get called a theory. I don't really think it's a theory, but this is just my own hang-up, I guess. It's more like, it's like basic rehabilitation counseling. It's like, if you have a disability, you select what skills you're going to work on that you still have, you optimize those, and you use those to compensate for the ones you don't have anymore. But it's interesting how many chapters and papers people can get out of that. Wisdom models I've started in recent years, I think, actually are kind of interesting, particularly some of the stuff coming out of the Berlin aging study. Again, Paul Baltus and a lot of his colleagues at what used to be the Max Planck Institute in Berlin for lifespan development. And then there's a few other people, Sternberg and some others have also looked at wisdom models. At least if you remind me, and I'm thinking about, we'll talk about wisdom some when we're finishing up intelligence and so forth. And then family systems models and aging, which just kind of try to direct attention to the family as an environment and the way that families affect the behavior and functioning of older adults. And some of the same kind of ideas as in Margaret Baltus's work with institutions and systems, but focusing on the family. One of the things that has always intrigued me about family systems is when it gets applied to aging, people start talking about old families. And then I started wondering, like, what's an old family? Because families always have people of lots of different ages in them. Every family is an old family, right? None of you have children?
But they're even though they're nieces and nephews, in my mind, my siblings were all older, and so therefore we're an old people. We're not like and that because I thought about it. So from my perspective, from the generational perspective, the parents they're not 60, 50, 40.
Yeah.
But even though there are all the grandchildren, their parents are seeing so I think maybe that the generation, I don't know, it's like my perspective is old.
I think the key thing in what you're saying is my perspective.
Yeah.